David Cook, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your background, and maybe you can start with what you see as some of the pressing issues inside healthcare workplaces.
Sure. Thank you, Michael, and a pleasure to be here. And I'm certainly honored to be part of this panel, to have this discussion, and hopefully have a wonderful discussion today and learn a lot from each other. Very quick thumbnail sketch of my background. I am one of the few people you're going to probably find that's a career HRist. That means from the time I was an undergrad, I decided I wanted a career in human resources, and then that path was set, and I have not veered off of that. Half of my career, as Michael shared, has been in healthcare. I'll talk about a little bit more detail in a minute. Prior to that, I was in the non-healthcare space and telecommunication, financial services, manufacturing, some other things, and then the last 18 years roughly have been within the healthcare space. I worked for two large regional acute care health systems, one BGC Healthcare in St. Louis, and then TriHealth in Cincinnati, and then most recently with Accent Care in the post-acute care space, hospice and at-home care, that type of thing. I've been fortunate enough to see the impact of healthcare, and I can say my proudest work has come while I've been in healthcare because of the mission that we have that's in front of us every single day. So that's just a quick thumbnail of my background. My pressing issues, really, one of the key things that I think about and we'll discuss today is coming out of the pandemic. We have a confluence of things that have happened, external factors acting upon healthcare, internal factors, and then just the whole shift from being in high crisis to now trying to get back to normal, and the impact those things have had on the healthcare worker and healthcare organizations, and the increased level of competition that's happened in healthcare as well. So those things all rolled into one create, I think, quite a few issues. And then also the other piece that's near to my heart is how to create even better leadership within healthcare that creates better environments for our healthcare workers to perform and excel and do the great work they do every day.
All right, so I'm going to come back to some of those, David. Rick, tell us a little bit about yourself and your perspective relative to the healthcare.
Sure. I have been, Michael, as you mentioned, an employee engagement researcher since my days with Gallup in the 90s. And I was there when they were developing some of their pretty well-known tools and products. And I worked on some of those in the very early stages. And I've continued that for decades since that time. And this research really revealed, I think, some particular vulnerabilities within the healthcare sector that, as a researcher, I look at everything with a pretty objective lens. And one of the things that we see is that healthcare workers have a very high sense of pride in what they do. There's a great sense of mission about helping people, and they are really the hidden heroes of our culture. But what's interesting about it is that when you look at the data in this study, it shows that healthcare workers are significantly less satisfied with the pay they receive. And I realize there's a lot of variability in the pay that different healthcare professional roles receive as compensation. But when you look at salary.com, which was a source I used to determine salary information for this study, the salary figure that's listed there is much lower than people might expect. And as a result, we see 7 out of 10 basically saying that if they were offered more money to go somewhere else, they would take it. So we see a lot of vulnerability relative to turnover. We also see, and David's got some great perspective, I know he'll share on this, that people don't feel recognized for the value they create. That's pretty well given throughout other professions as well. But the healthcare profession particularly feels that they're not being recognized or rewarded for the value they create, not only to their organizations, but to people's lives. I've heard anecdotally people say, I'm very proud of what I do, but I'm not enamored with the business of healthcare. And I'm not necessarily proud of whom I do this work for. So when you look at the turnover numbers, if you believe SHRM's data that says that the cost of replacing an employee is roughly 6 to 9 months of that person's salary, and you even take the low salary figures that I cite in the study that I got from salary.com and multiply that over however many workers you're seeing turnover, you can see that the numbers and the cost of turnover for organizations gets very high very quickly. So we see a particular vulnerability for turnover here, and particularly dissatisfaction that people aren't feeling appreciated for the work that they do, the incredibly important work they do, even though they have a great sense of pride in what they accomplish.
So David, let's come back to what you started with, and that is what was happening in the lead up to the pandemic, and then the corresponding impact on healthcare workers' perceptions, and now we find ourselves, the pandemic feels like ancient history, but it's not really. And
Sure.
what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Some of what I'm going to say is common knowledge. And then I'm going to share something that is my own observation, so to speak. And if we want to go into that, we can a little further. But when you think of the pandemic, during the pandemic, healthcare workers were rightfully so put at a level and on a pedestal within this this country and across the world because of the work that they had to do and what they had to face every single day going into work. Now, for many of those healthcare workers, they face those challenges even prior to the pre-pandemic because they deal with the worst of the worst relative to sickness, disease, etc. But for them, they were finally being recognized for it. And that felt really, really good for them. And they also, their companies would, the company I work with as well, would praise them, recognize them, reward them financially and otherwise throughout the pandemic in a way that we had not done before. They were being recognized and appreciated by their peers in other industries, their neighbors with signs in the yards, et cetera. So they were elevated to a level where their work was finally recognized for the importance that it serves in our society. Coming out of the pandemic, the world has gone back to somewhat normal, quote unquote, and now healthcare workers are another workforce within the broader framework of our society. And so you've also seen that other industries are now paying workers a lot more than they were previously because of the labor shortage and everything else. The remote work that Dr. Garlick mentioned is a differentiator that many healthcare workers do not have the ability to partake in. You have new entrants into the healthcare industry. You have more for-profit companies coming in. You have more companies that are not traditionally healthcare companies coming in and operating a different way, operating much more like a business. The pressures of margin have come back into play as well. You have, in many situations, reduction in average daily census in a lot of hospitals. So now you have to deal with that. You have a high bed capacity from an acute care space perspective when so much care is moving to outpatient. So you have all those struggles that are both revenue and expense pressures that are happening as well. And then you put all that together. The other piece that I've really noticed is healthcare workers going from being so exalted, right, and so rightfully so relative to work that they do every day and that we're doing in the pandemic to help us get through the pandemic, to now they're not as recognized. And that psychologically for a workforce that is very compassionate, very mission-driven, and very much takes pride, as Dr. O said, in their work, and they're not feeling that same level of recognition. So to me, it does make sense psychologically that they would not feel as recognized as other industries right now, given what has happened in the broader society.
And to amplify what David said, we see now that remote work, or at least hybrid work, has become pretty much the norm for many, many people. We see that if you're asked to come into the workplace more than 3 times a week, that's a very unattractive value proposition, right, for someone trying to hire. And in healthcare, you have to be there. You have to be on site, and you have to, in some cases, expose yourself to different vulnerabilities. And it's one of those things when you've got what David shared, feeling like at one point you might have been recognized for what you're doing, but now you've got people coming here and there's economic pressure and you've got everything sort of reverting back to what we call normal, but still not normal because you've got to go into work every day while there are other positions that wouldn't force that to be the case. You've got a pretty dissatisfied workforce in pretty crucial positions.
I think we can all remember those stories and the emotional sensations of we were all in need. We certainly had anxieties in the early days of the pandemic. We were appreciative of these healthcare workers. Remember reading the stories and seeing the media and press about people coming outside the buildings and hitting their pots and pans and celebrating as a way to say thank you for going out and doing it. They're still saving lives now and then. But yes, as you said, the world moved on. So David, outside of that, what's happening externally to the sort of healthcare populations? And what I'm referring to is the battle for talent consequentially more intense, or hasn't changed, that much? Meaning, are young people still interested in pursuing, careers in healthcare, putting aside the physicians, etc.? But has there anything been noticeably different, or that part hasn't changed that much? I don't know.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question that we, those of us in healthcare, have to continue to figure out how to deal with and how to solve. So the short answer to your question is it absolutely has changed, and the competition for talent is much more intense. Before I get into that, let me just share. We're talking about external factors. Let me just quickly touch on something that is, I think, critical to understanding the main part of the question, and that is the reimbursement pressures on healthcare companies have dramatically increased. The pressures have increased because reimbursements, both at the federal level and most commercial payers, have constantly being reduced. So that means the pressures to reduce expenses becomes that much more important. That's just the business side of it, right? That is just the nature of the world we live in. And so when you look at that, and then you look at the rising labor costs, healthcare companies, especially not-for-profit side, it's difficult for them to keep up with the cost of wages, the wage inflation that we've seen over the last several years. And so as other industries are raising the prices relative to the wages for their labor, and sometimes in quote-unquote non-skilled labor, you now have healthcare, so it's not-for-profit, that can't raise their wages as much in order to keep enough margin to fuel the mission, so to speak, right? The mission always stays central, but you have to go fund it as well. So the competition of talent is intense because you have people from healthcare who would not normally look outside of healthcare that are now going outside of healthcare, and they're finding non-traditional healthcare jobs in non-traditional healthcare companies. So a lot of companies springing up now that are doing at-home monitoring or telemonitoring and other types of things where they need a healthcare worker to review charts, et cetera, and they can work from home, but they're not a traditional workspace. So you have that exodus, so to speak. You then have, we already had a trend of a nursing shortage that now is exacerbated with nurses both retiring and nurses and other healthcare workers saying, you know what, I can go somewhere else and get paid same amount of money or paid a little bit less and not have to work in these environments, the pressure-filled environments that I'm working in. And then you have competition between the healthcare companies because healthcare companies are still building. And so they're building new facilities, and they need to staff those facilities. They're expanding their specialty programs. They need to find the healthcare workers to take care of those patients and to run those offices, et cetera. So everyone's trying to do more, and there's not enough to get all those things done. not enough people.
Yeah. And let me say this, David, all the observations you just made are really reflected in the data set that we've collected. Everything that you just said, we could certainly validate with data points, but let me even lay another level of interesting observations on top of that. For the first time in 2024, Gen Z, the people 25 and under, have supplanted baby boomers as being a proportion of the population. 14% Gen Z, now 13% boomers. So that's the workforce as a whole. So we're seeing more boomers retiring, and we're seeing more Gen Z coming into the workforce and moving through that belly of the snake, where they're going to represent in a fairly short time the significant proportion of the workforce, as millennials do now. And one of the things we see in our data very strongly, I don't think anybody would disagree with this, is that younger workers have less inherent loyalty to their jobs than those older workers. And that's for a lot of reasons. But for Gen Z, recognition is no longer a nice to have, it's a must have. You no longer, boomers might have felt, well, I get my paycheck, that's recognition enough. And if I get anything on top of that, that's great. But for Gen Z, if you're not recognizing people and you're not, stroking them, for lack of a better term, it's going to be a source of dissatisfaction. That's also going to be something moving on. And when you add that to everything you just explained about, feelings about I was once recognized, now I'm not, or there's really not appropriate recognition for the value that I create, and my pay is lower, and all those sorts of things, you're seeing a very, very vulnerable workforce.
So, and that's, adding to the macro trend of we're living longer. So we're going to need more of this. Demands and expectations of in-home healthcare, presence of, dementia and Alzheimer's, and all of us are going to get old. And we're all going to need, that support. So there is, I won't be as dramatic to say it's an existential crisis, but I guess we have higher expectations as a consumer of healthcare. So there might be a bit of burnout and dissatisfaction that might be appearing within the healthcare populations because they're the sandwich. In fact, you can think about this. We all know that feeling of where the sandwich generation, or at a certain period of time with, aging parents and children. Well, that's just, this healthcare generation of workers are the sandwich. The price pressures coming in. Nobody wants to pay increased premiums on their insurance. Demands of the population expecting, amazing healthcare whenever you need it, and then, adding to that expectations about, well, they don't even pay me as much. So
let me just add to that, the boomers retiring. We've all read about the fact that you've got this aging baby boomer population that represents a big chunk of the retired population. And we all know that's a group that's going to have increasing healthcare requirements.
Yeah, Michael, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Before let me just add one other thing, because I don't want us to feel as if it's a doom and gloom. It's not. It's not. These are challenges that industries have. Healthcare is going through their challenges now. But I am very confident, because I see it every day, that the vast majority of individuals who choose to be in healthcare, come to healthcare and stay in healthcare, are showing up every day to do fantastic work, right? They each have that in mind. I want to do a great job. I want to take care of my patients and take a lot of pride in that. And something I'll just add here that a colleague of mine once said, and that resonated with me, and I've kept it. And, this is part of, an understanding. And that is, she once said to a group of, I think it was nurses she was speaking to, she said, you know what, because they were talking about value and talking about, wages. And she said, you know what, we could never pay you your true value, but we'll work every day to try to show you how much we value and how important you are to us and to each of our patients. And I think that rings so true. And it's not just not healthcare. There are other professions that applies to the full extent of it.
And I think really that gets to where we're going, which is the
Mhm.
solution stage. That yes, it is a pretty painful situation right now, but we have answers, and that's also what we're here to talk about.
Well, let's dig in for a moment, David, on the line of thinking that you are articulating, and that is the individual, because this sort of theme of building pride has two avenues to it. The individual doesn't matter if you're back office, janitorial, security, nursing, even physicians, they're all humans and they want to feel some of it too. And then there's the pride in the company itself and the mission, the purpose of the hospital. They're distinct things. Let's talk about what you think a healthcare worker from any of those populations would be looking for beyond the pay and potential career opportunities. So put it in the context of the individual and whether you
Yeah,
want to provide examples of where you've seen it done well or not done well.
sure, absolutely. Glad to. Um, yeah, right. Each individual gonna make their own decision whether or not they're gonna stay, they're gonna go, and what they want to invest in the company that's paying them. Um, for an individual level, one of the things that I've learned about healthcare workers specifically is they have to understand that you actually care about them, right? More so than any other industry I've been in. They have to know, as a leader or leaders, they have to know you actually care about them as an individual, as well as the work that they do. So one of the things that I've found to be very successful is you get to know people on an individual level. You're present, right? You can't lead from afar. You truly can't lead from a truly effective lead healthcare workers from afar. So being able to round on them, purposefully round, not just showing up and saying hi, but actually sitting down, understanding what they're doing, job shadowing with them, take their place sometimes, scrub in, to the OR with them if that's the group that you're supporting. Round with your maintenance workers, with your food nutrition workers, to understand what they're dealing with every day and try to help them solve for the issues they have at hand. Don't presume you know what the issues are, and don't presume you're solving for everyone with one broad stroke. That time you spend with them builds a trust. And once you have that trust with healthcare workers, they will do any and everything for you to help the organization be successful. And they will have much more loyalty than I've seen in other places, right? Doesn't mean some won't still leave, because healthcare has become a bit more price sensitive than it was previously relative to the healthcare workers. But that has been a way that I've seen work the best in my time in healthcare. You also have to figure out what is it that they want to be, how they want to be rewarded, right? What is it? How do they want to be recognized? Sometimes it's just a pat on the back. Sometimes it's just an acknowledgement. Sometimes it is just a simple, hey, I'm gonna throw you, just kind of a food party to say thank you. I'm gonna give you t-shirts. It could be all those simple things, right? You don't want to overrely on things like that necessarily. But it's getting to know them, it's rounding, it's spending time understanding what they really want, what they need. And as a leader, you have to change your outlook relative to how you think about healthcare workers. The dynamic has shifted so much and will continue to shift.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of professions out there you can think of where people are underpaid for the value they create. Teachers, law enforcement, social workers. But people still go into these professions because they do have that sense of pride and mission. David, I think what I hear you saying, and what I would certainly reinforce, is the idea that if you're a leader in a healthcare organization or a manager, you can't be passive with your workforce. You've got to be actively engaged, and recognition and reinforcement and reinforcing the importance of the work that people do becomes so much more important in this profession than it might be in other professions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
And that goes for those in support roles within healthcare. So folks within HR, within finance, those type of things, those are the functions well, because they help the system go. So skip level meetings. One of the things I love to do is I have skip level meetings on a routine basis, right? So you go one or two quote unquote layers down from where you are to meet with people because they're not used to meeting with you, and you're doing one-on-one, two-on-one, maybe 3 or 4-on-1 type of thing, small group meetings, but you're staying connected.
So I'm going to come back, David, to some of those tactics and ways of which to affect a change. But I want to put for everybody who, or for those that don't know, the context of the data and the research that that Rick is referring to. So, being in the business of reward programs, employee reward programs, and recognitions for some 22 years, I felt there was a question I was still trying to understand, and that was, what was the purpose of this? What were we really achieving and doing as a result of these sort of programs? And what sort of data was there to support it? Got the opportunity and introduction to Rick Garlick, and Rick then said, I want to put a study together to quantify it. So I just, Rick, put a little context of what is this study, how was the mechanisms, and then we can look into some of the data and then come back relative to some of the tactical things that David might suggest people consider. But
yeah, I think that's a great question. And even like, why is our approach to employee engagement different from what you might find with all these other companies? Having worked at Gallup for many years and still have a lot of respect for that organization, still have friends within the company, even to this day. But when you look at the percentage of people that Gallup identifies as being fully engaged in the workforce, I think the last number I read on their website was 32%. 32% of the U.S. workforce is fully engaged in their workforce. Well, when you look at it over the last 20 years, and you take the average of the last 20 years, you know what that average percentage is? 32%. So we've seen a little blip up, we've seen a little blip down, but it really hasn't significantly moved in the last several decades that we've been studying it, despite the fact that we've been spending millions and millions of dollars, not just on employee surveys, but on incentives, on recognition programs, all these sorts of things. We're not really seeing any meaningful movement in the percentage of people who say they're fully engaged in their jobs. Now, the reason I believe that this is the case is because we're not focused on the right thing. And what I mean by the right thing is what really neuroscience tells us what really drives behavioral change are the emotions we feel. My argument would be that too many of the approaches that we've been using are too focused on the rational side of our brains and not enough on the emotional side. So the concept of pride and what your organization represents, Michael, pride in one's work, pride in the company. What is it that motivates someone to stay in a healthcare profession where they might be putting themselves at risk and they're not really getting paid what they could be getting paid somewhere else? It's the pride in what they do. That creates that stickiness. And when you look at what we've studied and what we look at and what we focus on, it's all about the emotional connection that people have to their jobs, their work, and their companies. We see that pride, individual pride in what I do, connects to things like job satisfaction, discretionary effort, coming to work every day. But then we see the company pride as being more connected to things like the ability to attract and retain employees. So they're closely related, but you can have, in the case of healthcare workers, a situation where you might have high pride in what you do, not necessarily high pride in who you do it for. So this is really what this study is all about, and all the research work we look at is how are people feeling in terms of the pride they have in what they do and who they work for. And we all believe that this is the key to engagement and moving that needle beyond that 32% that it seems to have been stuck at for the last several decades, in spite of the millions of dollars that have been spent and the tremendous effort that's been spent on trying to move that needle.
So for the benefit of, so we've done 2 cycles of the study with 1,000 respondents for each. One immediately after the pandemic data set, which I think was sort of late 2021, 2022, and then again 23, 24. And we're, already seeing some consequential data points changing, whether that's generational shifts. I mean, certainly all of us were affected by that period of time. But anyway, so we're going to get into some of those interesting data points inside it, but I want everyone to hear the study.
Also, Michael, let me just mention that we oversampled healthcare and retail workers. So we have a full sample for those individuals above and beyond the 1,000 that you meant representing the general population.
Thanks for clarifying. So let's come back to, David, your thinking before, and that is the ways in which to affect and impact pride or recognition or appreciation, or all the words that ultimately come together to support that emotional connection that Rick's talking about. We know lots of people are out there doing tactical programs, so that our work is trying to get to the core of that emotion, which will be a combination of human to human touch points, the role of technology, the role of t-shirts, the role of balloons, birthdays. They all play a role in a general employee experience. It's not one thing, but if you do them in concert and you're thinking and designing those experiences in an orientation toward pride, then at least from our experience, the multiplier impact for the relative investments, consequential financially, and also that you're really creating an intended experience as opposed to a bunch of ramshackle sort of executions that, well, maybe they work or maybe they don't work, no idea. So let's come back to some of your things that you've seen, and is it coming from leadership? Where does it start? How do you approach, this question of the emotional experience of employees?
Sure, and so let's take it back from tactics to strategy, right? So the way I have operated, and my recommendation, actually others operate this way as well, is for this particular topic, you start with what's your total reward strategy, because it is about total rewards, right? And total rewards has multiple components to it. It's not just one, but the end product is to have a highly engaged workforce that trusts their leadership and trusts the organization. So you start there, and each organization has to figure out how do they want to go about that. But you really start with that. One of the places I've been, one of the things we did that was very helpful is we did a conjoint survey. For those who don't know what that is, we basically ask a series of questions of our workforce, and depending upon the answer, would branch to something else. And it was, would you prefer this or prefer that? For instance, would you prefer a $500 annual bonus or a 3% raise every year, right? And then depending on your answer, it branches off something else. So it's allowed us to understand what are the greatest wants and needs from our employees, right? That's on a broad base, right? So we created themes, et cetera. And then we built our strategy from that. That said, okay, this is really what's important to our employees, and therefore, if it's important to them based upon what's in total rewards, that means there is an emotional attachment to those things for them as well. So we built strategy around that. Then it was the other piece of it that's very important is the leadership aspect of this. I don't think any of us can deny, because the data is there and it's been repeated over decades, that the most influential person to someone staying or leaving is their immediate supervisor. And so you have to train and retrain leaders to understand what it means to give a high value employee experience. And you decide on what those companies might be, et cetera. I don't want to get too academic about it, but you have to do that work as well. You can't just rely on, well, we're going to say everyone should round and everyone rounds and we check the box and everything's done. That's not enough. You have to train people how to lead in a different way and how to understand what is happening in the environment and how those changes are impacting them as well. Because the leaders, they're going through it as well. The changes are impacting them also. So they have to deal with their own change. And as you're doing that, you're then figuring out what are from that strategy, you're figuring out what are the programs and pieces that allow that strategy to be executed. right? And that could be internal resources you have through L&D or compensation, whatever it might be, or it could be external partners that you look to fill the gaps that you don't have, or that have strategies or tools and resources in place that you don't necessarily have available to you. And to build them would take too long and be too costly. So it's all of those things you have to put together. It's not a simple solution, just round, so to speak, and it's done. It is a strategy, and then execution of the strategy, understanding what it takes to make that strategy come to life. But does that help answer your question, Michael?
Very much so. And
Okay.
and I'm going to go right. Here's sort of the related question. I'm putting my logs together. I've got my strategic pillars, and I've got my kindling, and I've got all of that, and I need to fire it with something.
Yeah.
Which part of the organization is responsible for firing this up in your mind, or who, or departmentally? How do these come together? We've seen some clients do some amazing things. We've seen some clients doing some not so interesting things. When they're amazing, that fire burns. And interesting, it self-sustains. That's a topic for those that are interested. It self-sustains, years, decades later. But where do you think the spark for this sort of comes from? And how do you make the spark more than a single log with a single tactical execution?
Sure.
Like
No, that's a great way to describe it. So let me answer it. I'll say this. Typically, it's going to be HR. Let's just talk HR broadly. That are the ones collecting the logs and help people understand we need to build this fire to sustain our warmth, right? And just from an HR perspective, the way it's happened in most of my experiences, or the way we've orchestrated it, is we look at their organization development team as our R&D. They really help pull together what are we trying to do, what's to help build the strategy, what are the resources needed, and our business partner team or our journalist team are the ones that are really heavy into execution. Other functions within HR play a huge role. There's TA, there's comp, there's benefits. All those pieces play a role, but just from a R&D execution that standpoint. But when you have those logs built, if the catalyst or the person sparking that fire is not the CEO, you're going to have some difficulties. So either if the CEO is already there, great. And I've had those experiences. I've also had those where the CEO wasn't quite there, and it's my job and the job of the HR team and my peers who are in alignment with what we need to do, to help the CEO understand that he or she has to be the spark. Because if they're not behind it, it's not going to carry. At least not in my experience. It's not going to carry long term. So you talk about the spark, the person actually lighting that match has to be the CEO because he or she stands behind it. The executive team has to be truly the sponsors of it. The executors are going to be more so at the leaders, the frontline leadership level, and in combination with HR and other support functions.
I would agree. Easy to say, harder to do. Right?
Absolutely.
Easy to say, hard to do, and hard to get to a point where there's a sufficient business case around it that the CEO, in fairness to the CEO, who's obviously got a lot of agendas simultaneously, gets to the point that says, I want to do this. I think the business case, however, is very strong. Partly to Rick's earlier point, we've been investing in engagement for a long time, and significant dollars efforts have been put into place to produce no change in the, at least Gallup survey results. Why is that? It's possible that expectations are rising in a parallel sort of trajectory to the investment and efforts being made. I would often sort of share from my observations that we see lots of clients doing all these tactics, but they're not coordinated or concerted in any organized manner beyond, well, 10 years ago, somebody started this program. 8 years ago, someone did something else. 6 years ago, someone, 4 years ago, 3 years ago. If you got them to design them all again, they'd all go, well, no, they probably wouldn't look anything like that. But whatever, I'm too busy to deal with that, question. But anyway, so Rick,
I'm sorry, Michael. Can I just add on something real quick? I think it's to emphasize that I think it's critically important that you mention, and that is the business case piece, right? Historically, oftentimes HR leaders would go forward with a plan or idea or strategy just because they felt it was good for the workforce, and it may have been, or just it was the right thing to do. Well, you can't do that anymore. You really have to have a business case. You have to understand what the ROI is and why it's going to be something that not just the CEO is going to sign off on, but the CFO is going to sign off on as well. So we have to, for me, it's a given. You always come with a business case as to what you want to do, especially when it's a large expenditure of company funds. So that was a critical point you made, and I don't want it to slip by without really emphasizing the importance of that.
And to your point, David, and please keep your thought, Michael. I know you're going to ask something, but I just want to reinforce the point that you made, David, is that we should have learned something in 2008 when the recession hit. There were a lot of incentive trips and a lot of incentive programs that came under very, very heavy scrutiny because no business case had really been made. And there was a lot of investment done in things that people felt that we shouldn't be investing in, particularly when it came to incentive trips that people took. We believed them to be motivating to salespeople and other professionals, but we had no business case. Since then, the incentives industry has done a lot better job at preparing an ROI case, but sometimes it's difficult to do because you're trying to translate what we would call soft numbers into hard outcomes, right? We've done some work. I've done some work with Michael where we've looked at, through his tool, the percentage of people who have been recognized and related that to then subsequent turnover, and have found significant differences based on the amount that people were recognized versus people who are not recognized in terms of turnover percentages. Then when you take that 6 to 9 month salary data, you multiply that over the percentages. Now you've got some pretty big numbers and a good business case to make. So that's one example of something we've done that I think plays exactly into what you've just described.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
So, going on, Rick, with that, in one of the analysis we did with a client, 50,000 healthcare lives over 3 years, and tracking the correlations between what at least externally appeared was unwanted turnover. We'll call it turnover. We don't know all of the circumstances, and recognition activity. If the employee, having joined the business, did not show some interactivity, either receiving recognition, appreciation, or giving recognition, appreciation at some consequential level, they were 70% more likely to turn over. Now, the business case multiplied by the cost of a healthcare worker replacement, the potential amplified effects on the rest of the team, department, or otherwise, and all the others, the business case is easy, still needs to be done and made. You've got to also have a receptive audience, which is always a challenge, is to go, does somebody actually want to hear, some of these? But anyway, the business case, particularly in healthcare, I think is very strong, and it's not new investment that's being discussed here anyway. The orientation of some of the initiatives towards a more unified view of, if we do it in this direction, in this way, we'll bring more consistency and alignment. So for instance, looking at, again, some data points from the study, one of them, I feel trusted and respected by my manager. And it has a pretty big delta between healthcare workers and non-healthcare workers. Do you want to talk a little bit about what your observations are relating to, what does that number tell us? What does it mean? And why is there such a big difference between healthcare and non-healthcare?
The data that we've analyzed, and again, there's so much data that I've looked at over the last couple of years of working with you, but the data that we've looked at shows very, very clear relationships between recognition and turnover. You know, we've seen it time and time again, not only in survey data, but also the behavioral data that you've just described that we got from a large healthcare organization. Whenever the item that you just pointed out, I feel trusted and respected by my manager, that was just one of a number of items where there was a big delta between healthcare and non-healthcare workers. You could go down the list. I mean, peer recognition, senior leader recognition. The healthcare population just simply feels they're not receiving the same recognition. Now, some of that might be perceived, to David's point, that they were used to a certain level of recognition and now it's tapered off. So the gap feels bigger than what it might have otherwise. But certainly in terms of the perception of the healthcare worker compared to the non-healthcare worker population, there's a big gap that needs to be addressed. And that's, I think, the point being, you add to that all these other factors that David eloquently spoke of, and you've got a pretty big healthcare turnover concern. But we've also, I think, through the course of our discussion, really addressed the solution on how to mitigate at least a pretty significant portion of that, through recognition, reinforcement of the mission, all those things that tap into not only the pride of the individual and what he or she does in the workplace, but also the pride that a person has working for a particular organization through all these kinds of things. We're getting positive cultures and creating cultures of inclusiveness and all those sorts of things that makes a person proud to be at an organization.
It seems to me, and I'll pose something to you, David, but it seems to me, and we do this across many industries, services, but it seems to me that healthcare is an industry who doesn't need it more necessarily than another industry, and that is a more holistic, unified approach to building pride. But an industry where the ability to harness emotion like individual pride and company pride will yield consequential outcomes to the individual contributor, feeling that they matter and that they're seen, and so the quality of what they're doing. I mean, remember patient satisfaction as a construct. Well, how are you supposed to deliver amazing patient satisfaction? And what delivers patient satisfaction? The food, the TV screen, the remote control, the bed, I'm sure they're all good. But the nurse, all right, and the interactions that the patient are having with the healthcare workers around them is a massive driver. So, when you think about it, David, and actionable strategies that people might consider for 2025, what are some sort of key takeaways that you might like to share with your wisdom, relative to, what we've talked and shared about today? What are you taking forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what I'm really taking forward is to a certain extent continuation of what's already been done, and that is, or that's been done, and then some additional things. So the whole perspective of understanding and getting to know your employees and your team members is critical. So that's consistent, and I'm taking that forward as a key strategy in order to make sure the connection's there and that we can understand why they do or do not feel pride in working for our company, why they do or do not feel like they trust leadership, why they are or are not engaged. So having that understanding and doing the legwork, and not depending upon just taking a survey data and presuming. You got to verify, trust, but verify, and be in and amongst the team to understand what they're doing, and do that as a leadership team, as an HR function, and that goes back to the rounding and everything else. The other piece is, as far as strategy going forward, the healthcare leadership, I'll go back to the point, has to be trained a little differently. Resilience is paramount in the environment that we're in and going into. But resilience, I think, was presumed to just be there for healthcare workers and healthcare leadership. Well, it's a different type of resilience now, and we have to help them understand and train them on being resilient and how that plays out in their day-to-day interactions, and how that plays out with them understanding what is it that's going to make the work environment the right one for their people. So really focusing on that piece of it, the leadership piece and the individual impact of the leaders is where I focus my attention for quite some time and where I'll continue to focus my attention. Beyond that, at the macro level, you have to be able to influence the executive team and in some situations the board, should you have one, that these particular macro strategies and investments are necessary in order to achieve the organizational goals they want to achieve. And you got to draw those lines of connection, that business case, et cetera. So there's other piece that is kind of continuing and expanding as well. And then the other piece of it is understanding who are the right people internally, externally, that will help you deliver what it is you need to deliver. Once again, if you have the resources internally, great. Oftentimes we don't. If you don't have it, go find it. Go find the right partner. I've leaned on partners throughout my career to help supplement what we didn't have or we weren't experts in yet. That's how I focus, and that's what I'll continue to do.
So do you think there's a propensity, David, at this time and period for, boards and CEOs of healthcare systems to be more sensitive to this topic and question of pride and addressing some of the, workforce challenges through this emotional lens?
Yeah, that's a more difficult one. As long as you can put it in the context of the organization objectives and priorities, and you can, but you can't do it just for workforce pride in of itself, right? To what end? Because at the end of the day, like it or not, boards and executive teams are responsible for helping the organization achieve its overall goals, which are multifactorial. And so we have to make sure we're bringing to bear the things that are needed for them to understand it. Now, they can be more sensitive to it because of the labor shortage and what we're seeing relative to the data, but you have to be able to present it so they make sure it's not just this is what's going on. This is the impact of what this data means, and this is how it impacts us, not just short term, but long term, if we don't deal with it now, if we don't take the steps today. And so you have to create that sense of urgency. It can't be a nice to have, it must be something you have to do as an organizational imperative.
All right, well, I've got to bring it to an end. David, thank you so very much for spending time and sharing your wisdom. I mean, I got a significant amount. I'm sure the audience did as well. Rick, thank you very much for being a part of it. For the audience, I'm going to share some information, a copy of Rick's study. I will provide LinkedIn contact information for Rick and David. And for those interested, this is our next webinar on October 17th. We've got a roundtable of great HR leaders, each of whom have run and built programs that have had great consequence to their organizations. And Dr. Bob Nelson's going to moderate a conversation, probing and asking, each of them what they got out of their programs, why they did it, what was the business case. So for those interested in the topic of recognition, appreciation, I'd certainly be saying this is definitely a webinar to get to. But thank you, everybody, today. I hope you're all well in your respective worlds and appreciate your interest, and especially Rick and David, thank you for your time today. All the best, everybody.
One last word, Michael.
Yeah.
Happy birthday.
Okay.
Yes, happy birthday. And Michael, I'll offer up, since I know we didn't chance to get to Q&A, if there are any burning questions that any participants have, if they want to send them to you, I'm sure Dr. Garlick or I would be happy to respond to them.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Appreciate you doing that. We'll organize and compile that, and people should feel free to send in some questions. We'll get that organized, and a copy of the study and a copy of this recording out to everybody that they may share within their organizations. Thanks, everybody. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Have a great birthday.